welcome everybody. If you heard us chatting before, sorry about that. We all logged on early, and welcome to everyone. This is our 8th in a series of ICSVE Zoom panel discussions discussing various issues of terrorism and violent extremism. And we're very happy to once again have nearly 200 professionals signed up for today's event from all over the world. Both from the United States and European countries, as well as countries as far away as Portugal, Nigeria, India, Kazakhstan, Tunisia, Myanmar, Ethiopia, and many other countries that I don't want to list to take the time, but we welcome you all. It's really cool to have this global village every once in a while and to greet you all, to see you. And it's wonderful to see many friends and colleagues among you. Welcome. In our last event, we had Jesse Morton, who used to run Revolution Muslim as an extremist, but who is now fighting violent extremism via his organization, Parallel Networks. If you missed that event or any of our 7 previous Zoom events, you can still watch the recordings, which are posted on our ICSVE website under events. And we're putting a lot of these things into chat. So if you open your chat, you'll see the links to those. And we always capture the chat after or during our events, and we send that out to everyone in the every participant. So don't feel like you have to cut and paste. You will get a copy of it. And you should be aware of that what you put in chat will also be sent to everyone after the event. Likewise, you can always view our now 201 short counter-narrative videos that feature ISIS and al-Shabaab insiders denouncing their terrorist groups. Those can be found on our ICSVE YouTube channel, and we're posting links to those as well. Today, we're very happy to have Peta Lowe and Shane Healy from Australia. It's 1 a.m. for them, but they agreed to stay up to share their knowledge and experience with us, and we're very grateful to both of you for that. So just try to pretend you're on our time and stay awake, please. And they're going to discuss their prevention and intervention work with juveniles, including assessments, preparing for repatriations, and carrying out rehabilitative work. We are also busy planning our next event. Sorry, we took a short break there at the end of August, beginning of September. But we're busy getting back on our every 2-week schedule. And we're also glad to hear from many of you about what you'd like to learn about and discuss in coming weeks, because we view this as an interactive village of sorts. And so we welcome suggestions from you on topics and speakers. And we hope to hear from many of you in the last half hour when we open it to question and answers. And you can put questions in the comments and live stream comments as we go along. We did 3 events back have some inappropriate comments, and we have now learned how to kick people out. So if you, here's your warning, if you insult someone's religion or are insulting on religion, race, or ethnicity, we will boot you out and not welcome you back to future conferences. So please keep it cool between us. We are a global village, and we have a diversity of experiences, points of views, religions, and we can learn from and enrich each other with mutual respect. As I said earlier, we will capture the chat, and we try to briefly answer any questions that are posed there that aren't answered in the event, and we mail them to everyone later in the day, as well as post them on the website with a recording of this event. And we will open the mic in the last half hour. I'd like to today, before we begin, to thank our ICSVE team. Today we have Zach and Molly both logged on. Zach Badorf, who makes our videos, and Molly, who runs our Facebook and Instagram and writes a lot for us and does everything, basically. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, the US State Department, their European Union, UN Women, Facebook, private donors, and the state of Qatar. These are sponsors past and present. And I always highlight that we are especially grateful to the state of Qatar for supporting our Breaking the ISIS Brand Counter-Narrative project, which enabled me to travel around the world chasing 247 ISIS defectors, returnees, and prisoners, catching most of them on video, and then with the help of Zach and Sheikh Ali, to work these into short counter-narrative clips, which we now have 201 of them. And we subtitle them all in 27 different languages. And since we are a global village today, I would like to put the invitation out that anybody that doesn't see their playlist complete with the 201 videos, if you have the energy to translate for us, we always accept volunteers, and we do rely on volunteers for translating the short scripts. They're about 50 lines each, and we're always really grateful when people help us with that, because ISIS does recruit in 27 different languages. So we need to answer them in all those languages as well. We also really thank Facebook. Molly has been running our Facebook campaigns and Instagram campaigns, finding out what works to send these counter narratives out to reach vulnerable populations, to get them to actually watch them and to observe their comments. In that light, I'd like to say we have a new report out. It's called Breaking the ISIS Brand Counter Narrative Campaigns in Europe. We put that in a peer-reviewed journal, and we're proud of it. And we also have 2 new articles in which our new research fellow Mona Thacker contributed. And she has been getting into the conversations that ISIS supporters hold. Oh, sorry about that. On Telegram, Facebook, and other platforms. And we've written 2 articles on that you might like to read. They're both on Homeland Security Today. So to start our presentation, I'd like to say that as a child development specialist, a mother, a grandmother, someone that's talked to adolescents that have been involved in terrorism and seen the children of these terrorists in the camps, I can attest to the fact that children and teenagers think very differently than fully formed adults, and they're sadly much more vulnerable to terrorist recruiting in ways that adults aren't. ISIS is a group that both kidnapped and forced children to take part in heinous crimes, and they also seduced underage youth into their group as fighters. I should also mention here that Molly has worked with juvenile justice and juvenile issues, researching and looking at some of these same issues. So she may have some interesting questions and points of view to add as well. But vulnerable youth need both protection and care to avoid these groups, and they also should be taken back out of the clutches. And this takes a special skill and knowledge of their developmental capacities and their needs to be able to work with these youth. Our guests today have both the compassion and the skills to do just that. So I don't want to take any more time away from their presentation, so I'll briefly introduce them. In our invitation, you received long bios for both of them. Peta especially has a bio that goes on, and she should be very proud of all the things in there, but I'm not going to read it because I don't want to cut into her time to talk. But she is the principal consultant with Phronesis Consulting and Training in Australia. She does some very interesting work in that capacity recently, and Jesse Morton also, if he's here. Hi, Jesse, if you've signed on. We're just interviewed by her, and it was a good interview and very interesting, looking at some of the things with PCVE. She's a former director of countering violent extremism for juvenile justice in, is it North South? No, what is
New
it?
South Wales.
How does it go? New South
New South Wales.
Okay. Yeah, you have NSW here. Department of Justice. Peta is a social worker and a specialist also in security studies, and she has over 15 years experience working with young people who display violent and antisocial offending behaviors. She's worked with individuals, communities, and their families to address these offending behaviors. So she's taking a systems approach, which is very important. And she's consulted with her country quite a bit. I'm not going to go on that. You can read her full bio in the invitation, and we'll also have it posted with the event later. Shane Healy joined the CVE team in June 2018, and he comes from the military intelligence. So he has worked and lived in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, Kurdistan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the UAE. So suffices to be said, he's been around and probably in a lot of places where extremism is flourishing. Shane has an extensive background analyzing threat posed by terrorist organizations like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, and ISIS affiliates. He's been part of several domestic counterterrorism operations, and he has a diploma in government Diploma of Security and Risk Management, and Australian Federal Police Advanced Counterterrorism Investigations Program. So Shane and Peta work together, and they're going to present this together. And I'm just going to open the floor, and if we stall, I'll ask questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to let the two of you speak, because I know you have a lot to say. And towards the end, we'll open it for questions for our audience. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for having us, and thanks for the introduction. One of the really nice things about being able to kind of present this with Shane is that it really, for me, exemplifies what we tried to do in the CVE team in juvenile justice, which is really take a multi-systemic approach to a problem that can't be solved by one particular group of professionals. So it's nice to be able to present with him and really reflect that in, I hope, the cases that we're going to kind of talk to you about and how we approach them, because from our perspective, there was no one solution to the problem, and we had to really all work together from different perspectives with different understandings just in order to achieve the best outcome. So it's really great to be able to present with Shane, and thanks for having us on. It's lovely to be able to talk about some of the work that we've done. So I thought I might just start, I guess, with a little bit of an introduction about how the CVE team itself in New South Wales juvenile justice kind of came about very quickly. Juvenile justice in New South Wales found itself housing quite a number of terrorism offenders, juvenile terrorism offenders. The first came into custody in 2015, and in about 2018, as an organisation, they thought they better get a bit organised about how they managed and responded to what was called an emerging risk, but really was a risk that was present. And so in that capacity, there was a small amount of money given, and I developed a team that was based really on a multi-systemic kind of approach to the issue. So it involved social workers, psychologists, caseworkers, intelligence, and we really tried to make sure we had a blended approach to assessment and intervention, recognising that, you know, it is a particularly heterogeneous group, especially when you look at juveniles in the space. So we really needed to make sure we had a balance of skill sets. So I think it's important to just put that up front, and that kind of explains a lot of what we're going to talk about in terms of what we did over the years that we were there. There were a few questions I think that you posed that were sort of designed to semi-structure, I guess, what we were talking about, and some of them were really, I think, really important points to talk about. So I've just kind of formatted, I guess, a way that we can have this conversation. The first thing I think that's really important to talk about is this dilemma of juveniles who are involved in the space, and whether or not they're vulnerable victims or they're rational actors. And that's a debate, I think, that will go on for some time, hopefully so, and a debate that we had within the team quite a lot, because while young people have vulnerabilities, and we definitely have to accept and acknowledge that and do all we can to protect them, they also do make decisions about their behaviour, not often well-informed decisions and without the capacity for real critical thinking and consequential thinking, but they do make decisions about their behaviour. And so there was this real impulse to see them, well, there was this real push to see them as impulsive. And in fact, most of the young people that we worked with, their actions, their behaviours were not impulsive at all. We're talking about young people who spent sometimes 12 or 18 months involved in activities. That's not impulsive behaviour by nature, but what it does show is that they really lacked the ability to think about what they were doing, to put it in perspective, and to understand the impact and consequences on them, on their families, and on their communities. So I think it's important that we recognise when we're working with young people that they do have some autonomy over the decisions that they make, but it's our job to help them make better decisions and to think about things that they don't necessarily think about because of their developmental age. I don't know, Shane, do you want to add a bit to that? Because you worked a lot with adults before you started working specifically with juveniles.
Well, so that was the interesting thing for me initially was a bit more of a training role, but coming out of the Middle East, one of the first things I noticed and discussed with Peter and the psychologists within the team was in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, they're not viewed as juveniles. Some of the conversations that I had with members of the Taliban, they were 17-year-old commanders of their area. Then I come back to new job in Australia, or under Australian law, they're viewed as juveniles, and it's completely different. And so I kind of had to learn the space in reverse, if that makes sense. Because to me, I remember one case in particular. I was sitting there with our psychologist from the CVE team and a psychologist from one of the centres talking about a convicted juvenile terrorism-related offender. So this teenager actually had been convicted in a court of trying to recruit and actually successfully recruiting adults to leave Australia and go overseas. And one of the psychiatrists kept saying, "Oh, but he's only 19 and he's only this and he's only that." And I'm like, at 19, I joined the army. I could get a driver's license. I could get a mortgage. So that was the constant. And I think it's from my perspective and what I learned the most, the debate that keeps having to be had, because people flourish at different age groups. You see it in sport and you see it in academia, you see it across the board. From about the age of, I guess, 12, and happy to be corrected, through to 22, people develop at different age rates. And I think it's hard when we're evaluating someone, and we have to keep that in mind, if that makes sense. So I guess to start with, from my perspective, when I joined the team, from someone who had spent the previous 10 years, in the Middle East and in various roles, from at one stage, if those the history buffs remember the de-Baathification policy in Iraq, trying to work out who was still loyal and who wasn't, to coming back to Australia to look at that. So that was an interesting thing for me that I'll start with.
So we took a real multi-systemic approach to not just our understanding of the issue of terrorism and violent extremism, particularly in Australia, because I think for us we had quite a different experience than they've had around the globe, and certainly in terms of the young people that were getting involved. They were very different to the profiles of young people getting involved in other places around the world. And so how do we understand what it is that's motivating each of those individuals to get involved in the various ways that they got involved? And, the matter Shane's referring to, that young person was a lot older when he got involved and a lot older when he got charged. So that's an interesting thing about our legal system in Australia too. So the age of criminal responsibility in Australia is 10. It's one of the lowest around the world. Yeah. And that's for both federal and all states. So anyone under 10 can't be charged with a criminal offence. Anyone between 10 and 14, there's a principle of delay incapacity which has to be satisfied before they can be charged, and that is that they have to be able to prove that that young person knew what they were doing wrong, that what they were doing was wrong at the time. Having said that, it sounds like that would be much harder than possible, but actually there's around 600 kids a year, I think, who end up in custody across Australia who are between the ages of 10 and 14. So there are actually quite a lot of people under the age of 14 who end up in custody in Australia. There's been lots of pushes in lots of places around the country to raise that criminal age of responsibility to 14. And I think there are a lot of countries who have done that as well. And then particularly in New South Wales, there's this interesting phenomenon where young people can be kept in custody in a juvenile facility up until the age that they're 21. So if they've been convicted as a juvenile, so they were offended as a juvenile and were convicted as a juvenile at the time of offending, the court can make an order that they stay in custody up until the age of 21. So when we talk about working with young people in juvenile justice in New South Wales, we're talking about 10 to 21. So we really do span that spectrum of developmental kind of milestones, I guess, as we start working with the older population. And interestingly, that one case that Shane's referring to was the oldest that we worked with. The majority of them were around 14 or 15 at their age of offending, and certainly the age that they came into custody was around 16. So they were much younger when they got involved. And there were a variety of offences as well, everything from recruiting to doing acts in preparation. So a couple of young people were actually interdicted on their way to commit a terrorist act. And then, of course, there's some famous cases in Australia of juveniles like Newman Hayter, who actually was 6 years ago today, I think, that he was shot dead in Melbourne. He was 18 at the time. And then in Sydney, in Australia, we have Farhad Jabbar and the Curtis Cheng murder outside of the Parramatta Police precinct. So it did kind of take around 2015, 2016. There was a lot of young people involved for a lot of different reasons. And we really had to figure out a way that we were going to assess each of those individuals. At the time when I started, one of the first things that I looked at was, where's the evidence? And what I found very quickly was there was none. And it was interesting having a conversation with Jessie the other night around that notion of everyone believes that we need the evidence in order to do something, but in fact it's the doing of something that gives us the evidence. And that was definitely the approach we had to take. So we drew on, our understandings of general criminal offending with young people. We drew on what we understand about suicide prevention. We drew from drug and alcohol, and all of that kind of informed us about what we needed to do. And really the primary thing for us was to do individual assessments and to have individual interventions that were specific to that young person and the reasons that they got involved, and therefore the reasons that we could, kind of work with them to rehabilitate and reintegrate. So in researching that, having a look, the assessment tool, I guess, that we kind of most commonly used was the Vera 2R. And I was very fortunate to work quite closely with Dr. Pressman initially on the use of that tool and making sure that it was really, particularly in the most recent revised version, that the indicators were really relevant to using them with juveniles as well, because it had juveniles. So there were some things around diagnostics that we needed to review, because obviously juveniles can't be diagnosed with particular mental health disorders under the age of 18. So there were some things that we definitely worked around. But what I really liked about the tool, and what I continue to enjoy about it, is it allows you to really look at the nuance of individuals and individuals' motivations, but also individual risk factors, and therefore individual needs and intervention plans. So we took a very multidisciplinary approach to the use of that tool, and there was a bunch of people involved in the assessment. So there was always a psychologist, there was always an intel analyst to help us make sure that we were using evidence, not just information, and to make sure that we had different kind of perspectives to understand what it was that was before us in terms of the information or the interviews. And we spent a lot of time talking to young people, and a lot of different people talk to young people in order to really get an understanding of, their motivations and what it was. And interestingly, one of the other kind of topics that comes up when you talk about this is everyone motivated by ideology? And that's, I think, a really interesting question. I am not an ideological expert, particularly not when it comes to the depths of knowledge that I would need to have an ideological conversation with someone. But when it comes to motivation, that's not the only, an adherence to an ideology or a belief is not the only motivator. And certainly in respect to the young people that we worked with, other factors like a sense of belonging, the ability to gain status or an identity out of it, to have that kind of sense of life purpose. Some of those things were real motivators for young people to get involved, and the ideology formed the pathway that they could use to achieve other goals. And so really understanding that is important, because if you're going to take an approach of intervention that focuses on ideology, and ideology isn't the primary motivator for someone's involvement, it's not likely going to be a very successful intervention for disengaging them. So that was very interesting initially, because there was a real belief and push that we were going to have to do a lot of work with religious leaders, with scholars, with addressing an ideology and a belief. And at that time, we were actually only managing Islamist extremist young people in custody. So, I mean, Shane's probably got more information that he can add to our kind of approach to understanding ideology, because he was, you know, responsible for having those conversations with young people to try and understand exactly where they sat in terms of ideological motivation.
I want to jump in here before you talk, Shane. It's interesting to me, one of our Zoom conferences, we had an Australian who was a juvenile when he was, not an Australian, an Austrian, sorry, Oliver, who was recruited, and Musa, who de-radicalized him, is present with us today. But one of the things that Oliver said was that he could have gone to either group. He could have gone to the far right, or he could have gone to ISIS, but he needed all those things you just listed, belonging. I mean, he maybe couldn't articulate it as well as you could, but that it wasn't ideological, but it became ideological. So is that pretty much what you're saying you saw as a pattern across these cases?
Yeah, absolutely. Shane?
Well, so it was the hardest thing to explain to other people too. One of the things that made it a little bit easier was, and this sounds, I guess, bad in a way, because it was the Manchester bombings, is they found books in the terrorist house, Islam for Dummies. And a lot of questions that I was getting from other people in the legal fraternity mainly was, why would they do those attacks if they didn't understand Islam, yet they were members of the Islamic State? And that's what we kept trying to say. Was that the motivation for joining? Motivation is the key. And as Peter said, you know, especially with juveniles, one of the first juvenile offenders that we worked with was more about showing off, and he read stuff on the news and then would say that in a class to try to get a laugh, and people were taking him seriously. So again, once you started to break that down and understand, then the other side of the house is the case that Peter spoke to with the two young offenders who were literally stopped before they walked around the corner to conduct a terrorist attack with bayonets. And that was a pretty famous case in Australia because it was a family affair. The stepfather was a very well-known Islamic State recruiter. The mother was very well known. She refused to sit in court. So every time she went into a court for any matter, and then she would walk out, you know, with a Tawheed signal, and really getting into that. It was all about he's an extremist, and it turned out he just wanted his mum's love. Mm-hmm. Once we broke his motivation down, it started at Ramadan, and his mum was extremely committed, you know, extremely devout Salafi lifestyle, and he felt that the only way he was going to get love from his mum was to live that same lifestyle, which got him to the point where, had the police not been following him, he would have walked around the corner with his best mate and bayonets and started stabbing police people. So that was the biggest takeaway, was every path into violent extremism and motivation is different. And we found the same thing from when I would be in Afghanistan talking to some of the detainees there, and it was more tribal. You know, this is our tribe and it's defending our area from our lands. And then from times in Iraq was, you know, where Sunni and they're Shia or vice versa. And so really you can't take the face value of what seems to be the motivation. And if you look at the greatest initial example in 06 of Zakawi, who did he attack first? when he really wanted to make his statement of this is who we are and what we're doing, he attacked a mosque.
Well, a Shia mosque. But let's stay.
Correct.
But let's stay with
Yeah.
Australia, because I think it's really interesting what you did as far as treatment in Australia. So when you were starting to identify generally what the motivators were, you were finding that they were not ideological, but they were more.
Yeah, so they weren't initially ideological in most cases. We did have a couple of young people who were very committed to the cause, and it became ideological, and they really did have not just a religious, but they really had kind of moral obligation as well to because they had that sense of shared persecution. It wasn't their lived experience, but they definitely felt it as in a connection to another group and the persecution. And then a lot of the young people that we spoke to, there were particular factors that contributed to that process of going from a cognitive belief about something to a feeling belief about something. And some of it was around the treatment of, particularly there was a bunch of anti-terror raids in Sydney, and they targeted a large portion of the Muslim population in Western Sydney. And a lot of the young people we spoke to sort of talked about that and their experience of that, of watching it, of being part of a community that was targeted. And that certainly helped kind of push them along that pathway, because they then began to believe that they were really persecuted and that there was a sense of injustice, and that therefore validated, if you like, what it was that they were already doing. So it wasn't like the ideology spoke to them initially. It gave them an avenue for other things. And I think, when I look at it, I think about when I was first learning around kind of sex offending with juveniles and these two kind of disparate groups of sex offenders. And you've got sex offenders who are purely sex offenders, and that's their offence. And then you've got others who are general offenders, and sex offending makes up part of that antisocial behaviour. And certainly what we found with the young people that we work with is we had this group of people who were violent extremists and who believed, for whatever reason, either ideologically motivated or because of their sense of belonging or because it gave them a sense of identity. And then there were others who found that espousing an ideology gave them a justification for engaging in behaviour that they wanted to engage in anyway. And so we saw that actually in, I can't remember what year it was, there was two young kids who murdered a service station attendant in Queanbeyan, and they used ISIS rhetoric on the walls. And that was really, they were general offenders. Those kids had been offending for a very long time, had long histories of both violent and aggressive offences, and lots of compounding complex issues. But what they found was an avenue to kind of justify, if you like, behaviour that they already wanted to engage in. So you kind of have to look at those groups a little bit separately in terms of how do you address that, and certainly how do you intervene in that. But if we look at the group of terrorism offenders that we worked with, there weren't even similarities in that group, and not even with co-offenders. So we worked with a couple of co-offenders who were very different in terms of their pathways in and in terms of their intervention needs in order to support them to get out. And as Shane was saying, one of those young people who ideologically was very strong, his actual motivator was he wanted love and care from his mother. And if he didn't espouse the same beliefs that she did, she actively rejected him. And so it took a very long time to unpack that, because ideologically he presented as though that was his main driver. But he'd learnt over the years that he actually needed to do that. He needed to prove that he believed it, or his mum rejected him. That's a really kind of important distinction to make about whether he believes what he believes or whether he believes he should believe what he believes. And for him, it was a really important point for him to recognise that he actually has a choice about all of that. And yes, it might mean that he chooses that he has to, to some extent put boundaries around himself with his relationship with his mum. But he is actively experiencing the consequences of doing the other. And he's in custody for a very long time. And he's now labelled a terrorism offender and all of the things that come with that. So it's
two questions on that. One is, when you're talking about this kid, did his mom just want him to be Salafi, or did she want him to be violent? And then my other question is, when you referenced the kids that got angry about the police raids or the security raids, whoever was raiding, I'm wondering if in talking to them, did you get any sense of how it could have been done differently or better? because there are times when police do have to raid. I mean, you know, if there's the possibility of an imminent attack and they do nothing. So I'm curious on those two things, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'll jump first in quickly.
You can.
So Western Sydney in the context of 2012 to 2014 is obviously the enclave for a lot of the Islamic community in Sydney, to the point where they were doing strict dawah at lunchtime at some of the high schools. And I don't mean one or two kids listening to a guy talk. I'm talking 30 or 40 kids on the Oval at a lunchtime. And then the law changed. We had where the Australian Federal Police, if they thought you were going to the Middle East to join the Islamic State, they would actually stop you and take you off the plane. So there was the debate: are we keeping the problem within Australia, or are we letting it go? But getting back to the disenfranchisement with the police raids, there was certainly some that were very warranted, but they never followed it up with any social work, and that was what we found. Is it's a holistic approach, because if they made a mistake, they never went back and said we're sorry, or there was no community engagement. It had the ability for the local agitators to really push that draconian narrative. They hate us, they're against us, you saw what they've just done, rather than they did try the soft approach a few times, and because the laws hadn't changed yet, some of the first Australian teenagers and young adolescents that went to the caliphate came home and spoke about it and actually weren't arrested. And so you had that narrative initially, then the laws changed, and so I'll let Peter speak to how that affected the youth from there. But that was the context of what was going on in Western Sydney at that time. Was the street dubber was one of the things that it was hard to believe that you would have 50 or 60 kids, teenagers, or 14, 15, 16-year-olds on a high school oval at lunch doing Salafi sermons on a daily basis.
Okay, but wait a minute. I want to make sure that we're not picking on Salafis, because most of us from Western nations would agree on freedom of religion. So is this a kid preaching?
So I agree. And that was my comment I was going to finish with.
Yeah.
When I got to speak to the young offender whose mum, and I said to him, what would you say if I said I've got no issue with you being an extremist? And he just looked at me, and after about 2 minutes, I said to him, what would you say if I said I've got no issue with you being the most devout Muslim that's ever been on earth? And he goes, I think you're setting me up. And I said, why is that? And I had another Muslim in the room with me, and he said, I think you're setting me up. And I said, why is that? And he said, because no one's ever said that to me before. And I said, but no one's ever lived over there. I said, I've met some of the most beautiful people on earth in the Middle East, and they just live their life. So I've got no issue with you living that lifestyle. You just can't be violent. And
I'll go back to the question that you asked before about the young person and his mother. She absolutely wanted him to be violent. And there's quite a famous picture of him protesting with signs. He was about 10 in a park, and it's, behead the non-believer. So she was actively, and when we talk about those kinds of, so they were the connection for the recruiters. That those street dawas were not just about practicing their religion, they were connection for the recruiters. And when we started to unpick all of those young people people that we talked about, even though sort of no one had ever kind of said there was connections. There was absolutely connections between those young people. They'd spoken to the same people. They'd been preached at by the same people. They'd been connected together as individuals at different protests, that no one had ever put those pictures together. So, and I know that one of the questions is, do people self-radicalise? And I guess in our experience, none of them did. They had someone either in their real life or in their online life kind of helping them. They definitely wanted to understand more and they sought out information themselves, but they didn't move themselves along that pathway, if that makes sense. And I think the second question that you asked, Anne, around how could that have been done differently, I agree with what Shane said. There was never any follow-up. So there was never any reaching back into that community. And I think it's really important that security and law enforcement do that sort of stuff. They reach back into the community. And there is no issue with explaining this was something we had to do to keep people safe. And part of the work that we did with one of our young people was family work. So we actually did family therapy with his mum and dad around accepting and acknowledging the things that he had done, trying to put back together some of the relationships in that family, because they had been around while he was offending and had not been protective factors, because he had isolated them and they had isolated themselves. So part of the work was putting that all back together. It's very difficult to do, and you have to put the effort into building the trust and the relationships with the peoples and the communities that you're working with. But in my experience, there hasn't been a community, a family, a parent that I haven't been able to engage with on some level to say that we can help, because most of the time, all they want is something better for their child and they don't know how to get it. Or the community just wants something better for the community and they don't know how to get it. We definitely had resistance, particularly reaching into some of the communities to say, can you help us? But that trust comes from actually just putting your money where your mouth is. If I reached out to a community and I said, these are the things that we're going to do, and I'm going to be honest with you about how we do that, and we're going to keep working with you and talking to you, it might take 2 or 3 visits. It might take them to see us actually deliver with a young person that we're actually following up and doing what we said we were going to do. But once you start to build that buy-in, even just with one community, and that relationship builds from there, and that community vouches for you with other communities, I haven't found, honestly, ever in my career in juvenile justice, working for a government, to be prohibitive, because it's the way I as an individual approach that. And it just takes more effort from me, and it takes me to acknowledge and recognise that there are going to be barriers, that people are not going to want to talk to me. And so my job as a professional in that is to get past that. I've got to acknowledge it and accept it and figure out how I work around it, figure out how I get the buy-in and the motivation. And it's particularly difficult when you're dealing with communities that have been marginalised and in Australian context anyway, demonised. It really was very difficult to live in those communities for a long period of time, and it's still very difficult in Australia to live in not just Muslim communities but other ethnic communities. We talk about multiculturalism, but I'm not sure that we actually live it, because there are still a lot of people who don't feel part of our community. And I would say that was also a common thread with the kids that we worked with. So they were all second generation of those who had been convicted of terrorism offences. And I think what they struggled with was a sense of belonging from their parents' country of origin. So they had never lived in that country of origin, but their parents had, and they had a really strong connection to tradition and culture. But these kids have grown up in the Australian culture, which is a little bit removed from that country of origin. But they also weren't entirely, involved in the Australian culture either. And so they'd kept some of their country of origin. They had a kind of a foot in each camp, for want of a better way of saying it. And there was a real lack of, where do I belong? Like, I don't understand where I fit, and I'm rejected by parts of each of those communities because I'm either not traditionally cultural enough or I'm not Australian enough. And so, this provided them, we'll accept you, basically, is the message. And I agree with what you're saying. Some of these kids could have gone either way. It's just that they particularly found that avenue. And, some of the kids that we worked with weren't convicted. We worked with kids who we recognised were vulnerable and kids who were actually being radicalised. And we did a lot more diversion than we did rehabilitation, because one of the things that I can say now that I don't work for the government is in each of those cases of those kids who were convicted of terrorism offences, we failed them because we knew what pathway they were on. We could have intervened at different points in time and taken an interventionist approach, and we didn't. We took a security approach, and we waited and we watched and we investigated and we prosecuted. And we kind of created terrorists when we had young kids who were vulnerable and radicalising, and we could have done something different. And I think that harms everyone in the community if you wait to that point. So I truly believe that, particularly when you're working with young people, that diversion is where we all need to be focused. We need to stop those pathways.
Can you comment on when that would happen? What are the signals, and where would you recommend that you step in on those signals, and how? Because I'm listening to a beautiful blonde, blue-eyed, I think, your eyes look blue, and imagining your skills that you can go into these communities and somehow in 2 or 3 sessions deliver something or something about yourself that hooks them, that they believe you, that you're there for their good. But I'm wondering, when you're getting signals, what are the signals that you believe should have been acted on quicker, and how would you act on those signals? Because all of us in all the countries that are listening today have that same problem of when and how should you intervene?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. You know, and I've argued a lot with myself and with lots of other people about this, because I have to challenge myself on it constantly. But I actually think that I don't understand why we don't do more prevention work. So I don't understand why we're not having more conversations with kids about this space, about understanding what it is and breaking down some of the myths and the barriers. And I do kind of liken it to the early suicide prevention work, you know, which happened around having those conversations and raising these issues and flagging the risk with kids. And really, you know, we ran a pilot program in one of our centres for kids where we basically worked on how would you notice if one of your friends was getting involved in, and it was right-wing extremism at the time that we were particularly focused on, how would you notice if one of your kids, so kind of making them aware of the space and understand that themselves, because they're going to notice changes in their friends before anyone else does. But I think of the multitude of people who are involved in young people's lives, so everywhere from school to, you know, youth workers to football coaches, you know, the number of people who can notice those changes early on. And I think if people understand that, the earlier we notice them, you know, talking to someone about getting involved in a violent extremist group, if you do it the right way, isn't going to make them get involved in a violent extremist group. It's like suicide prevention. We had this notion that if we talk to kids about suicide, they're all going to go and commit suicide. And I think part of it is about us accepting and being a little bit more comfortable with having the conversation. Because I think the earlier that we can have that conversation, the more that we can recognise those things they can recognise in themselves and others. So I would say for some of our young people, the very first sign is that they start to stop doing the things that they were doing. So they stop being involved. And this is the difficulty with adolescents, because they are changing, they are developing identities, they are starting to figure out where they fit in the world, and they may one day decide they've played football their entire life, they, you know, under 13s now, and they've decided they don't want to play football anymore. It may be totally normal adolescent behaviour, but that's a point for us to have a conversation. So it is a point to start to say what's going on, and not just go, oh, that's totally normal adolescent behaviour, or I don't know what's going on there, but I'll wait and see if something happens. Like, it is a point to start to have a conversation with young people, and that conversation might be a range of things. And I said this quite a lot in my time in juvenile justice, was around, we don't know what risk we're protecting them from. We don't. It could be getting involved in criminal gangs. It could be mental health issues. It could be suicide. It could be drug and alcohol abuse. It could be violent extremism. We don't know what risk we're preventing them from, and we'll never know. And hopefully we'll never know. But if we have that conversation early enough, we know that we're going to be better at preventing those risks. So those changes that people recognise in young people are a point for us to have that conversation. And it doesn't have to be, are you joining a terrorist organisation? I think people have to get more comfortable with how they have a conversation about what kinds of things are you interested in at the moment? What are some of the things that you spend your time reading about? You know, oh, you're not doing that anymore. What are you doing with your time instead? And start to open up the conversation rather than directly ask questions about what the risk factors might be. And we do this in so many other areas of a young person's life. This is just another area to raise people's awareness to that's a risk. And my issue with this area of risk is it actually, more than anywhere else, impacts on entire communities and the world, whether we like it or not. So I think that there are points, and we certainly did a lot of training with staff in juvenile justice around identifying indicators and looking for young people who have particular vulnerabilities and how we can, you know, not monitor for investigative purposes, but monitor for changes in behaviour over time that are points of intervention for us to have conversations. And so, you know,
that was a part I was going to wait to see if came up. Education was the biggest key for us. We would have spoken to 1,500 staff members in rural areas, you know, and the amount of time that they would say at the start, oh, this doesn't really concern us, but, you know, we'll sit here, and at the end of it, they'd come up, well, you might need to know this, or I noticed this. It was educating, you know, teachers and coaches, getting people to understand those signs. For us, it helped immensely because, like Peter said, then that allowed them to start that conversation. Hey, why are you feeling that way? But if they don't know what to look for, they're never going to know to have the conversation, if that makes sense. So for me, education is a big one.
And it's that conversation that really helps us build. And you know, everyone talks about critical thinking in the space, and I agree. It's about, you know, trying to understand what's going on so that you can have that conversation. And it can be really simple things like, you know, we used to talk to staff about that kind of externalizing of the issue and talking to kids about maybe what's on the news, because it's a bit safer to talk about that. And then starting to talk about how you can think about whether what you see on the news is the real news, and relate that to a young person. So, oh, you know, you can see offences on the news. Are they always the way they play out? Do you think the news might, you know, embellish some of that? So that starts that conversation then, which helps build that critical thinking, because you're offering another point of view. You're starting to say that may not be the truth, and it's in a really benign, kind of less threatening, less confronting way, because you're not talking about their beliefs necessarily. But if you're not starting to have those conversations or find those points for intervention, then it becomes a very difficult thing to do once someone's already formed a belief, to change their mind about that. And you have to do a lot of work to try and get them to understand, to firstly raise it to their consciousness that they've got this belief that's based on a whole bunch of things that maybe they don't understand, but then also to challenge that, because we all hold our beliefs, right? That's what makes us who we are. So we protect them because they're of value to us, and that's no different.
So like Peter said, one of the biggest things that I found, and part of my role was that first conversation with the juvenile, was they would be the lead story in the news that night. When one of our terrorism-related offenders was in court, all the kids during dinner would see that. And so they would see the elevation of status because that juvenile's on TV or on the news. So we would see some kids trying to become part of that belief simply because of the status that they were trying to seek. So that was an interesting thing that I never had occurred or had experienced overseas, but in this context and environment, because they were essentially famous because they were on the news at night, others in their cohort saw that as an opportunity for them to get the status that they were trying to achieve themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, so I lost my train of thought.
I want to raise a case to you that there's someone who works in the Aarhus model in Denmark. His name is Mohammed, and Mohammed as a kid was like the kids that Shane was talking about. He came back from doing Hajj, and he was very proud, and he dressed in his Islamic clothes, and he started spouting off some things that sounded extremist in school. But really underlying it was a sense of identity. Like, I just went to Hajj and I'm very proud of my Muslim identity. But his teachers and the other classmates got really concerned. The principal called the police. His house got raided. I think they took his computer. He got set out of school, and he lost the school year. And the police program that Thorleif runs contacted him and said, "We'd like to bring you in and set you up with a mentor." And Thorleif got cussed out at least 6-7 times by, "You ruined my life," by this securitized response to, I was being a kid, and not interested at all. But Thorleif's, I think a lot like you, Peta, got that resilience and has a loving approach. So he just kept going after this kid. And finally the kid said, "Okay, I'll meet the mentor." Well, he is now a mentor himself. So his life got totally turned around. But I'm wondering, because this is a question like FBI asks me all the time, and people that are watching kids on the internet, and so much is happening on the internet now, that they say, how do I know when I should do something? And it's really hard to know. And I understand what you're saying about these conversations, but that's a very resource intensive thing to.
So my answer to that would be immediately. Because that's when the sooner you can have that conversation, the quicker you can understand the motivation. For one of our clients was in a little country town, and he just had this amazing inquisitive mind. He wanted, and he'd been looking up some Columbine school shootings and stuff, for example. And to most people that was threatening, but he just goes, "I found it interesting that this bloke felt this way," and it was just his thought process. But the sooner you can have that conversation, actually say, well, this is where his thought process is, and you can do that intervention. Let's get him in this program or in that program. I think that is going to reduce the risk rather than, well, I guess what I'm trying to say in the short term, it's better being early and safer than late and sorry.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I take your point, Anna. It is resource intense if you're looking for a specific resource to do it. But I really believe there are lots of people in these kids' lives. And I think, for me, wouldn't it be ideal if everyone could have that conversation, if everyone felt comfortable? So a lot of it is our own fear as professionals about getting it wrong, not picking it up, not knowing, feeling really, and a lot of our staff, or a lot of the staff at Juvenile Justice, felt really uncomfortable about having those conversations. And I'd have to talk to them about what makes you uncomfortable. And it was literally because it was a conversation based on belief. And they didn't know how to have a conversation with another person who believes something different. I think, I talk about counter narratives a bit, and I've got this personal perspective about counter narratives that I think, what we should be doing is opening this up for conversation, because once we close down that conversation, people become scared about saying anything. Then it becomes taboo. Then it becomes a subject you're not allowed to talk about, and we make it worse than it is. What we need to be teaching our kids in particular is, how do you have respectful conversations when you don't necessarily agree with or understand what someone else believes? How do we get people to feel more comfortable about that, so that first conversation that's had with a young person isn't, are you a risk and do we need to do something about this? It's, I want to understand a bit more about that. I want to know why you think that. I want to understand that. I don't really understand that. Can you tell me more about it? And people get uncomfortable about that because they're then worried about carrying that risk. But I would say that we create more risk if we don't have those conversations early on than we'll ever create having those conversations early on. It's just, how do we get people to feel more comfortable about that? And it really is because if I'm cynical, which I'm known to be at times, there's a massive industry being made out of this. That means that we try and exceptionalize the knowledge in this space, and really it's not that exceptional. We're just talking about engaging with humans, about human stuff. And many, many people do that in their life all the time. Sure, once you start getting to the pointier end of that, once you start getting to work with people who actually have started to form beliefs and are really on that pathway, you need the right people in their life. They're not always experts though. It's just someone who can talk to them. But early on, I think we should all be able to have those conversations. I mean, that's a robust society, right? That's what we're after, a society that can have those conversations and tolerate that difference, and not just tolerate it, but embrace it and enjoy it and relish in it. That would be ideal. It would also make us all a whole lot safer if we approached interactions with everyone that way. So I think that there's varying degrees of where we need to exceptionalize this space. And obviously right at the end where there's threat, that's exceptional, and we need exceptional people to deal with that. But way before that, where we're talking about even pre-risk, I think it's a conversation that many more people need to be involved in, and then it's not so resource intense. I do understand the issues around intelligence and police and the work that they have to do trying to find needles in haystacks. I just think there's a lot more people who can be involved in that process if we get people to feel more comfortable in the conversation, which is why I love stuff like this. Hopefully it's opening it up for people who haven't had those conversations to go, maybe I could have that conversation, and what would that look like? So I think...
You have one comment from Saeed Abu Hatim, who says it's so important, the medium, along with the message on these conversations. So if it's the FBI that comes out and talks to you, it's going to be quite different than if it's someone like you, Peter, coming and talking to people.
Yeah. So that's an excellent point, and I'm lucky enough to have been on both sides of that. I started in the obviously military counterintelligence, counterterrorism space, and then got into the CVE space, and am the greatest advocate of, if we get to counterterrorism, we failed because we've allowed that person to get there, which is why I'm a big advocate of education and having the conversation as early as possible, because unfortunately, and I had the job of overseas of the terrorists. So if we can stop that, I think we need to get, and that's why I'm a massive advocate of the narrative. Let's have that conversation. Let's educate teachers. Let's educate anyone who, online courses. What can I learn? Because the more people we have, as Peter keeps saying, having those conversations, the less counterterrorism that is involved, and I think that's a win across the board.
I'm just noticing Emmanuel's conversation, like his comment about avoiding two fundamental aspects of the debate: the attraction of the ideology, which I absolutely agree with, and the extraordinary efficiency of the methodologies. And I agree with that as well. I mean, Islamic State was particularly good at reaching their target audience, and what a great target audience to reach. Because as far as juveniles go, you're working with young people who it doesn't take long for them to form a belief, and it doesn't take long for them to act on that belief. So, you are working with a really good population if you want people to move really quickly and do what you want them to do. And it's not hard. I agree with that. And I think right now what we're experiencing in Australia is that exact same attraction to the ideology of right-wing extremism. And it's the same thing. It's the kind of, what's it offering? Again, that's not necessarily about the belief of the actual political, religious, or other ideology. It's about, what does it offer for me? It gives me a sense of belonging, or it's going to give me a sense that I've contributed to something greater than myself, or that whole meaning of life thing can't be underestimated with young people either. They are looking for their place, and if they've got something that offers them that, and it's really easy and it's clear, and I know what I have to do to find my place, that's really attractive to young people who otherwise it looks really complicated and I don't know how I find the answer to that question. So I do agree with that. I don't think it's avoiding it. I think what it is placing it in a context that helps us understand And it's particularly why Islamic State are very good at what they do, because they know that pinch point, and they know how to reach that audience, and they know how to tailor their conversation and their argument to reach the kind of people that they're trying to reach, which is those who are looking for that answer. So I think it's a good point to make, and I think it's about ideology regardless of the form. Like I think it's about that process of selling someone an idea or a belief.
Peter, one of the reasons that we made our videos, our counter-narrative videos, which are stories of ISIS people saying it didn't work out for me, it wasn't a good idea, is we wanted somebody that would relate to our target audience, you know, so have some of the same grievances, or, you know, have lived the same life, and to say why they were attracted, and then to say why it really wasn't a good idea. But I totally agree with you that prevention is the name of the game, because, you know, we can work on getting people rehabilitated, but then we're playing catch up always, and there's too many victims of the people that do manage to commit crimes. But I'm wondering what your opinion is, because I've always wondered if you caught kids in 8th grade when they have to take some kind of government or civics course, and expose them to the far-right ideologies, expose them to the ISIS Al-Qaeda ideologies, and said, these people will catch you with emotions, but let's look at just the cognitive part of this, and the promises that they make to you, and that, you know, as far as we know, none of these groups have delivered long-term. That in the short term, they'll make you feel that you belong, but they're doing that because they want to use you.
Yeah.
Do you believe that that's useful to do something like that, some kind of inoculation with youth?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's building those skills that we should be building in young people anyway, around that critical thinking. And I do know that there is some work that's done, and I think, you know, I think the UK has got some of it in their prevent strategy as well, around that kind of early exposure or conversation, or having those conversations. Yes, I think, I mean, I'm hesitant to say that's just an education role, though. I think it's, you know, it's broader than that. It's also about equipping families and communities and, you know, even peer groups to kind of have some of those conversations. But yes, I think the more that we can raise people's awareness to the fact that this is what happens, but is that exactly, you know, what do you need to think about in terms of whether that's just something that you buy wholly and solely. And, you know, we did it a lot in Australia, and I don't know if other countries did this as well, with stranger danger. You know, back in the 80s, there was a real push to be critical about who it was that you were talking to, because, you know, prior to that, it was everyone in your community is safe. And we tried to really educate kids around that. You know, you need to identify people who are safe, and not everyone is safe. And I think it's just more about having those kinds of conversations with kids. Sure, there are people that you can talk to, but look, I think we don't do enough cyber education with kids either. The amount of online time that most kids spend, and they don't understand some of these things. They don't understand that might not be exactly who they say they are. That blows my mind, that even in this day and age, kids are not aware of the risks in that platform, in that forum. So I think we need to do more work in that as well, just generally. But yeah, I think anything that we can do at an early stage to have the conversation so that they can recognise some of those things as well. And it's the same, you know, it's the same as the approach to mental health. We want to try and get them to understand what they're feeling and how they're feeling it. And when they're not feeling okay, that they can have that conversation with someone. And it's kind of a similar thing. I think, just to pick up on something we were talking about before, and it's really important that you know, we find the right approach and the right intervention, even if it is diversionary with kids, whether it's diversion or rehabilitation. And one of the things that I would say is, in my experience, particularly in the Australian context, rehabilitation is particularly difficult because you might get someone to move away from an ideology, but the context and the landscape means that it's going to be very difficult for them to stay away. I mean, you know, if you're a terrorism offender in Australia, the reality is that you're going to be watched forever. You know, you are. And we have to prepare people for that, because if we don't, we're just sending them back out the same pathway. So I worry about the context of being able to reintegrate people when the system is set up to not believe that they're going to be able to be reintegrated. Like, we watch everyone. So I wonder what message that sends. But on the other hand, that's really good leverage when you're having conversations with kids about some of the pathways that they're taking, and you're trying to get them to think about consequences of their behaviour, because it's, you know, it is an interesting conversation to have with kids to say, you know what, in Australia, laws exist that mean you may never get out of custody, even past the end of your sentence. They can keep you in custody forever if they think you're a risk. So it's an...
yeah.
Sorry.
One of the best examples of what you're talking about, and globally, is actually an Australian, and it goes back to my comment about street Dawa, and I've just put an article in the chat for everyone to have a look at. So Muhammad al-Barrial was one of the most vocal supporters of the Islamic State in Sydney. He was a bodybuilder, he was a bouncer, he would walk around the high schools with a megaphone, talking about how good the caliphate is, and eventually he went over there. And then he realised exactly what happens in the caliphate and during the Battle of Mosul, and they played at a court case in Sydney a part of the transcript of the conversation that he was having with a recruiter in Sydney who recruited probably about 20 guys from Sydney to Australia to go into the Islamic State. And he's crying. He goes, "This is crap. I don't know why anyone would want to come here. I saw my boss get killed yesterday. I'm living in the dirt. This is not what I was promised." And so from one aspect, he was the poster child for recruitment and the movement within Sydney. But then when he personally experienced it himself in Syria, that actually it's titled, he was crying, and he was telling the guys back in Sydney, "Don't come. You know, I saw my boss get killed yesterday. I'm living in the dirt. This is, you know, I want to come home. Help." So it's actually the greatest case, and I, like a lot of people in the space, research a lot, but it's still one of the best ones that I've found, of the one guy within a 12-month period when he's actually had to live that life, almost put his money where his mouth is. And you can, and because it's open source, everyone has, you know, you can use it, and we used it a lot with some of the kids. Listen to what he's saying when he actually got to see reality, compared to the vision and the recruitment tools and the narrative that he was spruiking 6 months before, and he was getting other people to go and do what, when he went and did it, he absolutely hated it. So I think that was for me, and it worked when I would sit down with some of these juvenile offenders and say, this is the reality. As someone who's lived in these countries and experienced it, it's not a Hollywood film. This is what it's like. And this story that I just put in the chat, you read what he says, and you look at his background and the photos that they use in the article, and then you read at the end. And he died in a drone strike. So it is a great example of, and a real life example of what reality is. And it's turned, I can't tell you the amount of young kids in Western Sydney that one story turned around instantaneously when they saw that the effect of what was, they were being sold to actually what was happening.
I think that's what, and
yeah.
You were talking about in your counter narrative work, wasn't it? It's finding that point of disillusionment and then playing it back to people who are buying one side of a story. Yeah, which is...
And this is a perfect example because he was the guy that was spruiking it. It wasn't like someone else experienced it, and as you'll see in the article, he was the one who was saying it, then he lived it, and it completely, it was his voice that was saying, you know, I'm living in the dirt, I'm like this, and it's for us and for the work that, and the ones we really had a lot of success with, this was the article and the case that really made them stop and think, because he was the one who was going to the high schools. He was the one, everyone knew him. You mentioned his name in that Western Sydney area, everyone knew who this guy was. And then here he is, which is why the police released it to all the media, and they said, play it as much as possible. It's the greatest piece of counter-narrative work because it was the guy, you know, it was the guy. And it goes really to what you're trying to talk and achieve, Anne, as a great case study.
Thank you, Shane. And that's why we would love to see our counter narratives get played in schools with for prevention purposes. The time is going so fast, so I want to open it to a few people. And Molly, I promised you that I would let you ask a question, given all your experience with juveniles. Do you want to ask something?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, so something that I noticed, so my undergraduate research was in just kind of general youthful offenders. And what I noticed is that so much relies on public perception of the offenders themselves, unfortunately. Even, today, like this very day, we have people calling the 17-year-old Caucasian shooter in Wisconsin a boy, a child, and there's this adultification that happens of children of color, especially Black boys, who are viewed as adults who statistically people just guess that they're older. And so I'm wondering if you get a similar perspective in that people simply want to treat your clients as adults. Is there a difference that you see among juvenile terrorist offenders as opposed to juvenile general offenders, either because of their ethnicity or religion or the type of crime that makes people treat them differently and treat your work differently?
Such a good question. And I would say yes, in my experience, there's definitely an adultification, because the minute that you say terrorism, there's that real perception that because the risk is so high, we must treat them as though we treat adults. And in fact, in Australia, they're charged under adult law. They go to an adult court. They're treated as an adult when they get to those, and that's for any serious offence. They're treated as an adult, and it's exactly as though they were sitting in the court as an adult. And all of the provisions that apply to an adult terrorist offender apply to a juvenile terrorist offender as well. So it's not subject to any age restriction. It's literally the type of offence that you're convicted of. What I see on the other side of that, though, is that there's almost these polar opposite communities. They're kids, they were just sucked in, they didn't know what they were doing, to note they're adults, they're hardened, they're never going to change their mind, we should throw away the key. And I think it's really unfortunate when we have those kinds of really polar conversations about it, because actually all of our kids sit somewhere in the middle of that. And some of them made very conscious and rational for their developmental age, I'll say that, rational decisions about their behaviour over extended periods of time. And others were more kind of influenced by it because of their developmental stages. It probably is much more diverse than what we view our normal offenders, like our general juvenile offenders as. And we tend to, even our legislation refers to them as young people. So we tend to be a little bit more, and I think that's more in recognition of their ability to change and rehabilitate, whereas we're not there with terrorism offenders really anywhere. There's still a massive debate about, does rehabilitation work? Can you actually rehabilitate? What does that look like? And I think when, particularly young people, when they go into something knowing that everyone believes they're not going to change, what hope is there for them? What incentive at all is there for you to try and change when everyone is basically saying you can't, you won't? So yeah, there is definitely an adultification in the way we treat them, the security services, the legal system, but then there is sort of a push, and I don't think it's helpful either to underestimate risk. I think we have to be honest about what that risk is, and we have to be honest with that young person. Otherwise, how can we address it? It's no good saying to them, oh, you were just young and impulsive, don't worry about it, you'll grow out of it. Because we're not being helpful to them unless we actually address what those issues are. How did you get involved? Why did you get involved? What were you thinking? What weren't you thinking? Unless we can break that down and really say, and, we have to say to kids who would say, I just won't go on the internet when I get out. And I know Shane had long conversations with a young person saying, is that actually plausible? Because everything happens on the internet. You bank on the internet. You book your doctor's appointment. Is it plausible that you can just say, I won't go on the internet? Why are you so worried about going on the internet? We need to break that down and understand that risk, because just saying I'm not going to do it is not it's not really addressing what those factors are. So I think we need to sit somewhere in the middle. We absolutely have to recognise developmentally where they are, and that plays an impact on their vulnerability and on their decision making and on their ability to think things through. But we absolutely can't just say they were kids and they just got involved and they'll grow out of it either, because we're not doing them any favours and we're not actually helping them kind of move past what got them into that position in the first place. So it's interesting that you say that about, you know, the different cultural types as well. And I think that's definitely at play. You know, we've had a couple of cases of young people involved in right-wing extremist kind of activity. We've had none convicted as yet of terrorism offences for right-wing, although we've had adults. But there's a very different perception of that and what they're doing than there is when we've had young people convicted of Islamist extremist offences. So they definitely are viewed as much more serious, much more adult, much more committed than the right-wing kids who are just playing around. You know, they're just mucking around, they're just doing what kids do and getting involved in things, and, you know, that's what they do. So there is also that disparity depending on what their beliefs are. I think we experience the same thing as you do in the States. And you know, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is overrepresented compared to our population. You know, I think it's, at the moment, I think it's around 60% in juvenile custody, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and they make up about 18% of the juvenile population in the country. So they are really vastly over. Yeah.
So Peter, we have Jessie Norton with us, and Jessie,
Yay.
I hope you're not snoozing. I just wonder if you have anything to say about this, because you've been on both sides of the internet debate, and how quickly kids get radicalized and how powerful radicalizers can be. Are you with us, Jessie, or are you on the phone with somebody else? He must be not really paying attention. I also wonder if Omar wants to say something. Omar?
No, I'm.
Oh, you are here. Okay, jump in, Jessie, please. We're waiting for you, Jessie.
I was having a hard time. I'm clear, honest. I've been running around, but listening in, specifically with the question on the internet. I think it's very important. Like, when we consider that the internet itself is a radicalizer, or that social media is a radicalizer, it really minimizes the stuff that happens and precedes. So we have very limited empirical data that suggests that social media in and of itself radicalizes individuals. I myself was connected to the first case that sort of rose those alarm bells. Her name was Rochelle. She was a young, who was having a hard time assimilating, having a hard time getting a British Stephen Timms came to her school. She stabbed him and ultimately is now doing life in prison. And when she was interviewed by the Metropolitan Police Department, they said, Roshanara, you didn't know any Muslims like in the real world. Like, you didn't know anyone. And you were not connected to Al Muhajirun or any of these movements. How did you radicalize? And she said, I radicalized online by watching this website, revolutionmuslim.com, and listening to Anwar al-Awlaki videos. And her explanation of that led to the very first initial controversy and push from Theresa May's government to start to pressure YouTube to take down content, who at that time, of course, social media companies' best brand was that they were committed to free speech and free expression. And we've seen things develop and evolve since then. The problem is we still don't have any evidence that suggests that the radicalization process starts alone, or that the variable of social media recruitment is responsible for radicalization. And so the internet, for me, it becomes a serious problem, because as we trek more towards restricting the utilization of the internet for terrorism-related offenders or violent extremists, and as we try to concoct, we're really not looking at the reality that the little bit of empirical evidence that we do have, for example, good, competent empirical research on those that went on to have the internet facilitate their radicalization into the violent extremism that led to their conviction in the UK, showed that it was actually the mainstream media and the portrayal of the war on terror that facilitated their interest in finding an alternative narrative, because it seemed to be so ludicrous, the demonization and the dehumanization that was seen in the mainstream media, that led them to look for alternative sources, and that preceded. So what we would do as radicalizers and recruiters, we never tried to like grab top-down recruitment and grooming, as a lot of people describe it. The grooming process is very much a two-way street. It's top-down and it's bottom-up. And so it's making the message available to those that seek it, and there are plenty of people seeking it. And in lieu of trying to remove and censor radicalization online, it gives the online radicalizer and recruiter the fodder they need to confirm the conspiracy that they're espousing, that the whole world is gathered together to suppress your ideas. And so if that's the case, then the problem of trying to restrict usage or prohibit anything, it makes it more alluring to those that in the real world are not getting their needs met for meaning, significance, purpose, belonging, and all of those other things. And so it really can be countereffectual and counterproductive, like a lot of the things that we're doing. So with regard to that conversation, I think it taps into a broader element of the discussion here today, which is like, we want evidence-based practices, but we don't have enough practice to get us the significant amount of evidence that we need to actually consider it's something that's valid to build programming around. So with regard to that, the only reason I would mention that, in tapping into the vein of the discussion about the role the internet plays and why we might prohibit it and how complicated that matters, I'll just end by saying, experientially, when I came home from prison in the United States as a convicted terrorist offender and one of the first to integrate, I wasn't allowed to have a smartphone, and I wasn't really still working with the FBI as an informant. But it made my life incredibly complicated, because like for me to use like Gmaps and to travel to like a place for a meeting, I would have to stop with my laptop, access the internet at McDonald's, Gmap the directions, write them down on a piece of paper, and then try to follow them while I was driving around. And it made it so that everything in my life suffered as a consequence of me being able to attain that like mental stability. Nobody would really consider that that might be the case, and I could give other aspects of your life that once you restrict access. What's that?
Yeah, sorry. I jump in there because I'm going to work on what Peter said before. One of the convicted terrorist offenders, juvenile offenders we worked with, was an internet recruiter, and their whole initial plan for him, and he was saying, "I'm just not going to use the internet." And I had countless interviews with him. Hey, everything these days is done on the internet. If you think, I actually was pretty blunt with him, to be honest, and I said, if you think that you're not going to use the internet when you get out, you're an idiot. And he just looked at me, and I said, because, and that was their intervention at that point, because but everything, like you said, he's done, and it's only getting more in line with that. But the other thing that you said, and I lived it again, and I hate to quote Russell Crowe, but in Proof of Life, he talks about it in his opening monologue. All we're going to do is drive them underground. If they're looking for that information, if they're looking for those groups, if they're looking for that, they're going to find it. And I witnessed that firsthand in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan. They were doing hand to mouth. They knew the law enforcement were, I'll give you an example. In Afghanistan, at night, they would put their phones in trees because they knew, or they thought, that that's what, we're being listened to. So all it did was drive them to have night secret meetings around. So teenagers or anyone who wants to find this extremist material will find it. And
I think the other thing, Jesse, that we talked about the other day, which is, I think is really interesting about what you said, it's not just not being able to access those things, it's the isolation that you feel as well, because everyone else can. You're exceptionalized because of it. You go back to being an other, right? Because you're the only person who has to pull over to, pull out your map. It's again kind of pushing you out of a community that you once more exceptionalizing you, making you another. I think that's the other point of it as well. It's not just the problem that comes from not being able to access that and all of the implications, but it's how it makes you feel as well.
Yes, and so it's stigmatizing, and we have to look at the history of prohibition and curtailment and censorship in history. It makes the problem worse in the long run. GWU did a study that modeled the effect of takedown or policing a platform like Facebook while not having the same policing on other platforms in an era of decentralized social media activity. And they found that under 4 models that they tested, hate speech and what they called global dark pools of extremism would migrate to different platforms, that they'd still be able to adjust and retain a presence and go back into Facebook, recruit, pull them to other platforms, and that eventually, as a consequence of doing that, censoring, and then the strategy in response of the extremists, in the long run, they got more hate online and they got a growth in the platforms that would be less prone to censor. And so it also would basically galvanize the recruiter with the narrative that we are in fact under attack, and ultimately shape shift the realm of social media activity and the presence between the mainstream platforms that have the resources and are under pressure to remove, but not thinking about the downstream effects of that, whereas they're just pushed to other platforms who will welcome the audience. The only model that actually worked to curtail hate speech, in the model that they tested in the GWU study, was a model that was based upon using holistic approaches to not removing the content, letting the content sit, and having a community or a civil society organizational approach to go in and to combat that narrative and to allow it to sort of use interventions and counter narratives in order to just concentrate on not allowing the ideology to transition an individual who was susceptible into the realm of committing a violent extremist act. And so it is right now. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
That'll go right on. Can Omar Sharif's been waiting to say something. So can we just let him say something, and then I'm going to let both you, Peta, and Shane make your final comments. But Omar, do you want to speak quickly?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Omar from London. I currently, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, and I'm so glad.
Yeah, thank you. And currently I'm running a Young Prevent advisory group, because I believe that the young people can be part of the solution. Myself, many years ago, Dan knows that I was a recruiter in Al Muhajirun for 9 years. Looking at different strategies, but looking at now, the recruiters are what they are doing online. They're very smart. They're moving so fast, and sometimes I feel like we're 10 years behind our schedule. They're always changing. They're always evolving. So looking at the counter narrative as well, but now what we're trying to do is try to equip the young people with lots of alternate narrative as well, in the prevention side and into the de-radicalization side. Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So Shane, I think you were about to speak, and if you both of you want to make some closing comments, but then we have to finish because we try to stay on time each time.
Yes.
We're so grateful to you, and you have to go to bed.
So I guess, first of all, thank everyone. But one thing that, if everyone remembers the Bataclan attacks in France, it was gaming platforms that they were using to recruit and communicate through. So World of Warcraft and these kinds. So I know it's trendy at the moment to pick on Facebook, and I don't have a Facebook account, but it's not the only platform, and that was correct before. They'll find another means, and we see that in the right side very much, where they have an active, they'll check you out before they'll let you into some of their sites. But training is essential. I think from someone who's trained around the globe, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in all these countries, education is the key to the counter narrative to the to what I say is winning the global battle. And I believe it's a global battle because if we don't work together, they'll find our gaps. They'll find our weak points. As we see in Europe, one country toughens their borders or toughens their laws, they just go to another country. So it's got to be a global approach, which is why I want to thank Anne for this opportunity, because it brings the globe together to share their thoughts and views. Because if we don't, the other side are, and they'll stay that step ahead. So I'll just leave it at that, and thank you.
Thank you. Peter, do you have more you'd like to say? I'm sure you could.
Oh,
speak
yeah,
up.
absolutely. No, I just want to, again, thank you. I think it's great to have the conversation. I mean, I'm always trying to push this in the youth space, that we need to kind of have these conversations earlier on in people's lives. And you know, all of the adult offenders were once kids. And I think if we can get involved earlier on, then maybe, you know, maybe, just maybe, we stop many more adults ending up where they do end up. And that's got to be better for everyone. And I just pick up on what Omar said. I 100% agree. You know, I wrote a piece for ASPI last year in their counterterrorism yearbook, and one of the things I said was, we have to get kids involved in this process. We have to start talking to them. We have to start, you know, empowering them to be part of the solution as well. So yeah, and I think the more conversations that we can all have about this, the better it is for everyone. And it is a global problem, and we all have to work together.
So those are great closing comments. Thank you both. And I hope you get a good night's sleep, even though you're going
Yeah.
to hope you can sleep in the morning. And thank you to everyone that came. And we're going to end the meeting now, but we will send the notes around. And I'm so sorry not everyone got to ask their questions, but I did notice on chat some people asked questions and others answered, and we're always grateful for that as well. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Shane, and keep up the good work. We look forward
Thanks so much, Anne.
continuing being in contact with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.